Good evening, friends. I'm Homi Baba. I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to see yet again a wonderfully packed room. I think you've been informed that this session is being filmed, so if anybody wants to put a comb through their hair or adjust your lapels, please do so. We are a feeder for some of the more prestigious Hollywood parts from here. The agents often look at our films when deciding how to cast Quo Vadis or one of those exciting films. But truly, this is a wonderful occasion. And I'm so pleased and really honored that Werner came to us and said, should we do something together? And as you know, Werner, nothing gives me greater pleasure. I first read Lionel Trilling's remarkable essay on the teaching of modern literature as an undergraduate at the University of Bombay. Like much of Trilling's work, the essay holds an abundance of intriguing ideas and insights. But there is one observation that has stayed with me ever since. The eager brilliance of a student who is quick to catch the professor's eye, whose ambition and intelligence makes him or her stand out dramatically, can be a mixed blessing. For such a display of competence can often distract you from seeing deeper into the character of the person. Character is an almost imperceptible combination of the subtle persistence of admirable values, an ingrained sense of integrity, and an innate judgment of what is appropriate and proportionate in moral and political life. Character is quiet confidence, exercised with sustained sensitivity and a sense of irony towards those persons and things that cross our paths. Today's event is a tribute to Werner's gifts as a writer and a scholar, but in the way in which he places his own life in the context of the rubble and ruin of post-war Germany, in the way he displays his gifts of character. Character in his work is manifested in the meticulous care with which he approaches the complex problems of living in a time of political and cultural transition. Every page is illuminated by the fraught and fragile afterlife of the war, caught in a narrative, a film still, a photograph, an event or episode. And yet, every page is also a record of survival, of the problems of guilt, of the constructions of anxiety, and the trials of transformation. Sollors lives on both sides of this complex temporal and historical borderline, and in finding a balance between the no longer and the not yet, to adopt one of his chapter titles, he reveals his great and enduring sense of character. This evening's discussion of Werner's new book, The Temptation of Despair, is an auspicious occasion in its own right, but it also informally marks the beginning of a significant new initiative at the Mahindra Humanities Center. With the support of the award we won from the Mellon Foundation, we are launching a 3-year university-wide seminar on the questions of violence and non-violence. The theme for the 2014 to 15 academic year will be war. The Temptation of Despair reflects, as Werner puts it, on that moment at which war ends, the moment of dramatic and unpredictable change that could mean so much to the ordinary inhabitants of a village or a town, and so much more to the surviving victims of Nazism, that moment that generated ambivalence in Germans opposed to Hitler and worries for the future among soldiers. This work of his is generated through a range of careful readings of representations in a variety of genres: diaries, photographs, novels, government reports, memoirs, and movies. Werner's book is about despair, but it is also, in its own way, about unpredictability, ambivalence, narration, revision, and, at the end of the day, in the hope of survival that always meets the conditions of an afterlife. Werner Sollors is Henry B. and M. Cabot Professor of English Literature and Professor of African American Studies at Harvard. His previous books include Ethnic Modernism and Beyond Ethnicity, Consent and Dissent in American Culture. We are greatly fortunate in having with us to discuss Werner's book, Janet Halley, a friend of the Center, who is Royall Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She's the author of Split Decisions, How and Why to Take a Break from Feminism, and Don't, a Reader's Guide to the Military's Anti-Gay Policy. We are equally fortunate to have with us Henry Rosovsky, the Louis P. and Linda L. Geyser University Professor Emeritus at Harvard. He served as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences from 1973 to 1991. His books include The University and Owner's Manual. Henry Rosovsky, in my view, is the much-cherished friend and advisor no faculty member at Harvard can do without. I certainly can't. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Homi and Sarah Razor, also for arranging this book presentation at Harvard's Humanities Center. I thank you all for coming here this evening, and I very much look forward to Janet Halley's and Henry Rosovsky's responses to the temptation of despair. People guiltily facing or avoiding the fact of the Holocaust after one of the bloodiest wars in history and after the violent end of a 12-year dictatorship in which basic human rights were suspended, people now living under varying Allied military rules and calorie allocations in cities bombed to smithereens, in a country much reduced in size in which millions of refugees and expellees had to be accommodated while the world had recoiled in horror from it. Perhaps it is not surprising that many felt and some succumbed to the temptation of despair, a phrase derived from Georges Bernanos, whose work experienced a revived interest in Germany after World War II. The temptation of despair traces fiction, diaries, and journalism, and it examines images and films from the grim early post-war years, the public memory of which has been dominated by the success story of the creation of West German democracy and the economic miracle that accompanied it. And this success story in itself has been used as a model for nation building ever since. The 1940s were also my first decade, and I've made occasional brief asides about my own memories of the period. In order to give you a sense of the book, I shall read you a condensed section about the representation of ruins and then say a few concluding words about the book as a whole. In 1945, the British writer and translator James Stern traveled to Germany with W.H. Auden. They studied the psychological effect of the air war upon the populace for the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Stern's report gave precise military information as well as glimpses of the people's experience in the face of hardly comprehensible catastrophe. Stern tells the reader factually that Darmstadt suffered only one raid of the classical saturation type, lasting 51 minutes and totally destroying more than half of the city center's dwellings. 8,433 human beings were killed or burned to death, and 2,439 were seriously wounded. After the raid, more than 49,000 survivors fled to nearby towns and villages. Now, Stern takes these facts and tries to penetrate them, realizing that the inhabitants of Darmstadt talked about this single air raid differently from people in München, which had been bombed 92 times from 1942 to 1945. People in Darmstadt talked of it as perhaps the survivors of Hiroshima talked of their single experience of less than a year later as the nightmare, in caps, that cannot be imagined by those who don't experience it, not ever to be forgotten by those who did. How many of us, James Stern asked, the unbombed, the uninvaded, do seriously consider sharing shattered Europe's sleep, the waking up every morning in some unlighted, unheated hovel to see all about us for miles the great graveyard and the permanent memorial of one short nightmare that would live with us and with our surviving children, unmentioned, unmentionable to the end of our days. Living in a bombed city may feel as if one had awakened from a nightmare in a cemetery, but Stern's ruins also resemble a high sea, a tempestuous ocean of pink rubble with jagged, perforated walls sticking up between the great waves, and Erich Kästner similarly drew on maritime metaphors when he saw the splintered churches of Dresden lying around as if they were wrecks of gigantic steamships hurtled on land by a cyclone. The burnt-out church towers look like cut-off masts, and a statue on top of a ruined building reminds you of a ship's masthead. Stig Dagerman, who wrote a wonderful book about post-war Germany, a Swedish novelist, saw rusty girders poke out of the gravel heaps like the stems of long since foundered boats. Stern finds the scale of destruction so vast it makes him think of an earthquake, the earthquake also with capital letters, the phenomenon of our era. And that too echoed with many other observers. Alfred Döblin in Mainz noticed the huge factories leveled as if by earthquake. In München, Max Frisch thought that if it had been an earthquake, a blind act of nature, one would find it just as difficult to understand, but at least one could accept it without trying to understand. The photographer Tony Vaccaro liked to put photographs of human destruction and of earthquakes together. In a talk that he gave here at Harvard, he talked about the earthquake of war and the earthquake of earthquake as the parallel. Now come the bones and skulls metaphors. John Dos Passos thought Frankfurt resembled a city as much as a pile of bones, and a smashed skull resembles a prize Hereford steer, and found the inhabitants behave horribly like ants when you have kicked over an anthill. Alfred Döblin similarly noted that in this diluvian catastrophe, citizens are running around the ruins like overwrought, industrious ants on a crushed anthill. Hertie's department store at Döblin's beloved Berlin Alexanderplatz resembled a man whose neck has been snapped with one blow, whose skull has been driven down onto his chest. The advertisements on the buildings made them look like a corpse in a brightly colored apron wearing a cheap bracelet. Max Frisch saw outer walls whose windows are as empty and black as the eye sockets of a human skull. Through a doorway beneath budding trees protrudes a frozen avalanche of rubble. It is an enchanting Baroque doorway, and it looks like a mouth in the act of vomiting, suddenly out of nowhere, vomiting forth the contents of a palace. James Stern found acres of corpse-like buildings with their black, hollow eyes. Kästner talks about the steely rib cage of City Hall. Dagerman, empty window halls like wide open eyes, ribs sticking out of bombed timber houses. And he found some ruins tall and boldly sculptured as victory monuments or small as modest gravestones. In Nuremberg's vast scene of destruction, Stern notices a detail that also fascinated others: a building which had been split clean in half as though by a knife, so that open to the public gaze stood 4 white-painted privies, one under the other, all alike and all intact, down to the chains hanging from the ceilings. In Breslau, Hugo Hartung observed apartments that are open like dolls' houses and put on display a private world of happiness to the curious or indifferent lookers-on. And Zelda Popkin described houses that had their fronts sheared away like stage sets, and the papered wall, pink, green, and blue, had been plowed and rutted and striped by recurrent rains. Private rooms stood indecently naked, an empty bed, all alone, 3 flights up on a cracked, rain-soaked wall, still hugged its corner, still held its bedding, and perhaps still held the bones of a child or a woman. To Dagerman, carefully manipulated facades with nothing to be facades for stand there like scenery for a play that was never performed. Max Frisch was surprised by München's new transparency. It was often possible, he writes, to see right across one street into the next. The picture is the same almost wherever I go, a city, but spacious and sparse as an autumn wood. In Frankfurt, Frisch saw the grass growing in the houses, the dandelion in the churches, and found that suddenly one can see how it might all continue to grow, how a forest might creep over our cities slowly, inexorably, a sprouting, unhelped by human hands, a silence of thistles and moss, an earth without history, only the breathing of years which there is no one to count. What the ruins revealed allegorically was, in James Stern's phrase, the hidden damage, for every German had become suspect as a possible perpetrator or accomplice. And in a different vein, Dagerman thought that the large group of honest German anti-Nazis were Germany's most beautiful ruins, but for the present as uninhabitable as the collapsed masses of ruined dwellings. Can we move on the PowerPoint here? Does that work? No. Anyone who knows how that? Oh, okay. Okay. But now we have to get rid of this somehow. Well, you can imagine behind this block Gertrude Stein standing in Frankfurt. Oh, you don't see the block, only I see. Good, very good. So Gertrude Stein, of course, always trying to defy rhetorical expectations, seemed to want to refuse any metaphor for ruins and wrote about Germany. We had seen it ruined from the air, and now we saw it ruined on the ground. It certainly is ruined and not so exciting to look at. However, when her trip took her to Köln, and she also posed at a place where tourists were taken by the American army to pose in front of ruins. There was a standard tour through the rubble in front of the cathedral. So in Köln, she commented that it is natural, of course it is natural, to speak of one's roof. Roofs are, in a way, the most important thing in a house between 4 walls, under a roof. And here was the whole spread-out city without a roof. There was the cathedral, but it looked very fragile, as if you pushed it hard with your finger either would go through it or it would fall over. So even Stein could not do without resorting to images. One is amazed at the array of metaphors and similes writers employed to evoke ruined cities, drearier than the desert, wilder than a mountaintop, and as far-fetched as a nightmare, as Dagerman put it. Observers were fascinated by the contrast between the imagery of death, corpse, decapitation, cemetery, tomb, a sense of the incongruous busyness of life, anthill, and ruins seemed hauntingly anthropomorphic, with ribs, wounds, eyes, skulls, skeletons, vomiting. The houses that had been cut open reminded writers of stage set or dolls' houses. The fact that the vast ruinscapes that gave cities an eerie sense of transparency were not the result of a natural disaster like an earthquake, but man-made, made observers think of geological times, of natural growth, and a post-human future. One could, with Georg Simmel's essay on the ruin, see an intriguing aesthetic fusion of art and nature in some of the ruins of the 1940s, yet they were not much like the ideal romantic ruin, whether from antiquity or the Middle Ages, in which the slow process of dilapidation was accompanied by a gradual emergence of natural growth. The ruins of the 1940s showed in an intense way what Simmel deplored in some of the Roman ruins. They made the viewer only too aware that they were the result of human destruction. Now, Germany's ruined cities were extensively photographed. We're looking at another register of representation. Margaret Bork-White made a thoroughgoing series of photographs of the bomb damage inflicted by the US Air Force for Life magazine. She took photographs block by block from a small plane, comparing the cityscapes below to her Baedeker maps. Photographers who worked on the ground liked to focus on people among the ruins. For example, Fred Kochmann represented a postman on his way to deliver mail amidst the rubble piles and empty facades near Frankfurt City Hall. Seen from behind, wearing a dark uniform and cap and carrying a leather bag over his right shoulder, the postman's vertical figure is sharply outlined against the bright, sunlit path between rubble mounds that seems slightly overexposed. Will he really be delivering mail in those ruins? The Swiss university-trained art photographer Werner Bischoff portrayed a man dressed in a regional costume with a Tyrolean hat and carrying a large basket, walking down an abandoned streetcar tracks in Freiburg. The angle of such photographs recalls the genre of perspectival urban photography and an earlier tradition of veduta painting, only that in ruined photography, the vanishing point of the perspective itself seems to vanish amidst the irregular mounds of rubble or end in upsettingly empty facades. One of Dagerman's sentences captures this allusion to a lost past very well. We walk for a while on what had been the pavements of what had been the streets and look for what had been a house, but never find it. It's a Dagerman sentence. Tony Vaccaro's post-war images often generate a tragic-comic dialogue between human beings and the destruction that surrounds them. And his photographs have had such a strong appeal to me that I visited him in New York, had long conversations with him about his experience of photography. Life on a Balcony, this is the photograph you see, shows an old woman who refused to leave her bombed-out apartment building in Mannheim and is sitting alone on her balcony. A thin string hangs out from her cast-iron balcony, the lifeline of her supplies, as Vaccaro pointed out. In the tradition of Walker Evans's Depression-era photographs, Vaccaro used the contrast between billboards and the surrounding reality. The best years of our lives. A Hollywood movie at the Thalia Theater, Darmstadt. The film title provides a black humor caption for the theater's hollow facade and the dreary street on which one sees a wooden cart drawn by two haggard horses and three pedestrians, among them a man with a briefcase. Of course, the plot of William Wyler's film about the difficult return of two war veterans is not at all a sugar-coated Hollywood story, but the poster works very well in this fashion. Vaccaro often employed a motif common in ruined photography, portraying a statue representative of Germany's cultural past that contrasts with the surrounding ruins. Vaccaro's Rossmarkt with Gutenberg Memorial, taken from a low angle, shows the intact monument towering over everything else, the monument devoted to the beginnings of book printing against the background of Frankfurt's ruins, including Katharinenkirche, the church where famously Goethe was baptized. Vaccaro's 1947 artist painting war ruins, the cover image of my book, is self-reflexive in capturing photographically the strange process of representing a ruin in art. And there's also quite a bit of self-reflexivity in the prose descriptions of ruins. And tellingly in this photograph, the painter seems hesitant to trace the parts of the building that were destroyed, while he shows more confidence in painting the intact part of the facade. In doing research for this book, I was happy to find that children, my generation, were a popular motif in photographs taken among the ruins of the 1940s. So Vaccaro portrayed two charming girls in the ruin, dressed in overcoats, holding a bag between them and looking straight at the photographer, one of them smiling, while standing on a street that didn't seem to instill too much hope in the viewer. Fred Kochman documented a group of boys and girls playing happily in front of the empty shells of houses. His editor comments that for children, ruins became mysterious caves and enchanted palaces in which one could play marvelously. And now comes one of my autobiographic asides. This was certainly true for me because I played in the ruins quite close to where Kochman had taken this photograph. The ruins served as a playground, and they contained a working pissoir destroyed in an otherwise destroyed and roofless restaurant, something that's pretty unmatchable as a playground installation. My first experience of seeing the ruins in Frankfurt, however, was connected with a semantic confusion. We were then living in Kronberg, a small nearby town with a castle, a burg, and we had often walked from there to the next town, Königstein, which had a much bigger castle called Ruine. Hence, I thought that ruin was the word for a big castle. So when my father took me along to Frankfurt one day, it was obvious to me that Frankfurt was much bigger than Kronberg or Königstein. Hence, I asked him hopefully whether Frankfurt had a Ruine too, and expected to be able to see a truly gigantic castle. My father responded with an ironic laugh, "Just look around you, these are all ruins." I still remember my deep disappointment at seeing burnt-out buildings rather than castles and noticing a painting hanging on a wall of an upper floor of a ruin. I was surprised that in my readings for this book, I found Stig Dagerman making a similar semantic connection in the post-war years when he wrote that amidst all the ruins of Germany, there still is one city that charges admission to a ruin, Heidelberg, whose beautiful old castle ruin looks like a demonic parody in an age of ruins. In 1950, Paul Röttger photographed 3 children playing a ring game next to Frankfurt Cathedral, already partly covered with a new roof, but still without windows. And so the children in images like that begin to have what Homi already alluded to, a sense of hope of something at the end of despair. So the ring game goes on, and it looks like there is something at the tail end of it. So let me say a few more concluding words about the book as a whole, which also gives me an opportunity to thank Lindsay Waters, Bill Sisler, and Harvard University Press for publishing the book and for permitting me to include many photographs. In The Temptation of Despair, I asked such questions as how was the end of the war experienced in photography and diaries, reading at very close range the 1945 diary of an anonymous woman in Berlin, with its vivid and highly literary representation of the arrival of the Red Army, of hunger and life in ruins, in the context of other war and post-war diaries, made me wonder why several diarists felt the need to revise. It is a book about revision too, you're right, and substantially alter their original entries about 1945. I became absorbed by a photograph taken by George Roger soon after the liberation of concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, when hundreds of freed prisoners were still dying every day. Published full page in Life magazine, it is both shocking and eerily beautiful, and it made me want to find out more about the photographer and his subject, as well as address the question how our responses to images may be guided by captions. How did it feel to live in a world after Dachau, I asked, and Dachau was the big code word, as was Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, rather than Auschwitz in the immediate post-war years. I asked when reading novels with revenge plots, looking at guilt placards, posters with horrible photographs from concentration camps that were put up all over cities in the British and the American zone, and the representation of ruins when reading journalistic reports and fiction about the vast population transfers, or the post-war, or the situation of displaced persons in the post-war period, where many of the concentration camps were reused as displaced persons camps for 5 years after the war. And it was from this chapter that the excerpt that I read you was drawn. What would a 1945 encounter look like between a political theorist of democracy and a thinker who had very vocally supported fascism, anti-Semitism, and wars of aggression? I settled on the case of the liberal Karl Löwenstein and the National Socialist Karl Schmidt, who is surprisingly popular in the United States today. What did they think and write about each other and about the political issues of Weimar, Nazi Germany, and the post-war order? Then, what was the role of black soldiers in a Jim Crow army that set out to eradicate racism among the defeated? Was anti-black racism put into any context with anti-Semitic racism? 3 novels, 2 short stories, and Toxie, a film about a mixed-race German occupation child, raise these questions and offer differing answers. I saw the movie Toxie when I was 9 years old, and that's the subject of another one of my personal asides in the book. Finally, how could the temptation of despair be overcome? Religious revival and socialist hopefulness were among the available recipes, but I wondered whether comedy was perhaps another important antidote. It is with this question in mind that I turn at the end of the book to Billy Wilder's wonderful film, A Foreign Affair, as well as to visual gags and to jokes that circulated in the second half of the 1940s. Now, writing this book has led me not only to works and images I had never seen before, but also to new contexts for personal memories of my own childhood. It has been quite a journey for me.
May I call on Janet Halley?
Sure. So I want to thank Werner and Homi and everybody else who was involved in inviting me to be here today. It's a thrill and an honor to have the page proofs of a book like this, and to be able to think a little bit about it with you. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to read the book as it read to me, and that starts with a pair of mottos from the diary that Werner mentioned earlier, The Woman in Berlin, an anonymous work. And we might put diary in quotes too. Werner clearly makes the case that it's a very literary work as well as a diary. A controversial point about it. One, preceding her first rape, the Soviet soldier who did it was being restrained by his commanding officer, and he shook off the order to restrain himself and said, "They took my sister." And paired with that, the woman's reflection, I think from Aeschylus, about this problem of revenge, rape, revenge, destruction on both sides, the sum of tears remained the same. There's something in the pairing of these two that captures what I want to talk about in this book, the endless repetition of hatred and violence. In one of his vignettes, Werner talks about Martha Gellhorn having just visited Dachau after seeing emaciated living and dead bodies of the Jewish inmates and then the fat dead bodies of SS guards that they had shot first thing on liberation. And she said, "And for the first time anywhere, one could look at a dead man with gladness." And there's something in this entire book that is a recoil from that motive, but also an attempt to confront the situation in which that motive could arise. And I think the book thinks, and it would be interesting to see if you think it, I'm getting it, Werner, that there's something fatal in this combination of dyadic thinking and double linked thinking, sameness or opposition, the only two ways to go, and judgment. So that's what I'm going to explore in my remarks. I'll take up one topic, the idealization of German suffering. Werner seems to want to know, can German suffering be, can it be good to free it from its right-wing home? A lot of the book is about how we should think about, how we could write about, how we could be ethically related to German suffering, given its appropriation by apologists and deniers. The Zelda Popkin on page 145 goes to Germany determined to side against the Germans as perpetrators and with the Jews as victims, and sees a truckload of people being evacuated from somewhere to somewhere, and asks herself, who are they? Homeless victims or Germans dispossessed? It's hard to tell. All misery wears the same face, end quote. And yet, the minute she feels outraged at the cruelty of a GI stepping on the hand of a German child reaching out for a dropped cigarette, what's happening to you, she asks herself. Have you begun to pity them? And this captures this turmoil of doubleness and judgment, I think. Or how to write about the population transfers. The chapter heading is population transfers, but in the chapter or the section, it's continually referred to as expulsions. How to refer to them when they became an apology for German complicity in the war camps, in the war and in the camps, and then got flipped into an accusation against the occupiers that they were no better than the Nazis. So they were endlessly, in a mirroristic kind of way, deployed for judgment. It's just what the Nazis did. Another quote, it is correct to accuse the Germans of having closed their eyes to Nazism's atrocities. This is an American trying to raise the alarm against the expulsions, having closed their eyes to Nazism's atrocities because they believed in the country's mission. Should the champions of democracy have accepted the same charge in the future, we too will share culpability if we do not reveal the outrages daily and hourly that are being committed today in the name of democracy and freedom. So at one point, Werner steps back and said, it is so easy to write an ideological critique and so hard to create art and criticism more fully expressive of utopian possibilities. And indeed, it is. And so I want to try to think about how does he identify these openings? Because there's nothing soft-minded about what he's doing here. He's not going to let it be easy for himself. In his comments on Billy Wilder's A Foreign Affair, he says, in its very inconclusiveness, the film cuts through the ideological rhetoric of occupation and tells a very special love story indeed. Perhaps the motto for this film could already have been the one that made the ending of his Some Like It Hot so unforgettable, and the line Wilder also is to choose for his tombstone, nobody's perfect. So another topic that I wanted to look at, somebody looking at atrocity. The photo by George Roger that was mentioned before is of a young boy walking along what would otherwise be a bucolic, curving spring landscape, curved road with some women way in the back, so a small boy wearing short pants and wool sweater, and he's along his to his left are just piles of bodies. And breaking up the bucolic scene really, truly horribly. And he takes us in his chapter through the initial readings of this photograph, in which the question is continually asked, how could the little boy be looking away? Isn't that just so German? To be looking away from the bodies. His face, his shadows, he's a little bit off to the other side. And then he reveals through, and this is one of the features of the book that I endlessly really love, is that research will show you more. And so what research shows you, if you go further down, is that he's not a German boy. He's an inmate. Actually, still hasn't left Belsen, and he's a Dutch Jew. Entirely flipping the rhetorical possibility of his deployment, which had been an extravaganza of American self-congratulation. And reading it, then I thought, but what if you did further research and found out that in fact he was actually German Protestant? What further reversal would be possible? But he captures some of that by pairing it, or maybe I'm pairing it with another photograph of what must be a German boy. I don't think drilling down would find a different answer. Looking at one of the guilt placards and standing intently with his back to us, absorbing this thing, and Werner talks about the outrage about the fact that Germans confronted with these newsreels, confronted with these guilt placards, would turn away in silence and say small evasive things, and why? Why would they not own the catastrophe that they had brought on others all over Europe? He says that he identifies from the translator of a woman in Berlin, the first translator of the diary that I referred to before, James Stern, who did the survey to find out. The initial idea was to go and ask the people who'd been bombed, did the bombing destroy German morale? And that's why he was there. But he went deeper and did his own research and came up with the idea that they did not express any feelings of guilt, because the feeling of guilt among Germans was so colossal that they simply cannot face it, much less give it expression. And on the next page, the nightmare quotation that you read before, unmentioned, unmentionable. So a piece of this is what is unexpressible, and on 2 consecutive pages of the book, it's the unexpressibility of Dachau and the unexpressibility of Dresden. And what both of them arising, giving unsuperable challenges to expressibility. Another topic, intellectual aid to the Nazi regime, and I'll kind of go fast over this, but there's an exploration in here about Karl Schmidt and Karl Loewenstein, and Schmidt's responsibility, and I think you are wanting us to confront Karl Schmidt's not passive riding along, not fellow traveling, but active participation in the production and justification of Nazi the camps, the wars of aggression, the exclusion of the Jews from civil society, the whole thing, the whole 9 yards. But I don't know what you'd say about this, Werner, but at the end he seems to pull back from Loewenstein's desire to have a campaign to have Schmidt prosecuted as a war criminal. That would be the right way to solve that problem. And pulls back from, in the subsequent chapters are about the deeply problematic character of the denazification propaganda campaigns that would take somebody like Schmidt and turn him into a guilt placard, right? And so what about that when you find this same binary judgmentalness and even militaristic authoritarianism in the denazification campaign itself? And repeat that after the film Toxie, about the occupation child, the biracial, what we would now call biracial occupation child. He peels back layer after layer of ideological kind of dreadfulness about the way the film could be deployed in some justificatory way that would be part of the problem. But then he goes that one generous last mile and discovers that so many of the people involved in producing the film had been filmmakers and actors in the Nazi regime, and asks us to wonder whether they had any choice. And so again, the living in kind of the police state par excellence. What were their alternatives? And so there's a constant looking for a third way, and that's what I wanted to bring up. I find it a very sympathetic effort. I am involved in it all the time, coming from the binaries of American identity politics. And into the kind of open-ended series of queer theory, I get this thing of learning for a third way. And coming from the law school, where, we're supposed to be in the business of dispensing modes of judgmental righteousness to people and, not really wanting to help with that so much. I find that a very sympathetic project as well. So I'll just mention I think I've got 3 ways that the book does look for third ways, and then I'll sit down. The one is children. The focus on seeing things from the perspective of children, seeing children seeing things. This is where a lot of the asides come in, and I'll just leave it there. But at one point he remembers himself being actually himself part of the cliche of Black American soldiers giving out candy to hungry German, calorie-deprived kids. The Coda chapter is about humor. Black humor parody jokes. The woman in Berlin and her friends would joke, better a Ruski on top than a Yank overhead, and what they meant was better to be raped by a Russian than carpet bombed by the Americans. They thought it was the Americans doing the carpet bombing. And at the end of the diary, the boyfriend abandons her because he can't stand the joke, because he can only give it an ideological reading. But the women saw it otherwise. And then finally, I would suggest revision. Revision, rereading, iterability, versions of things, rereadings of things, re-seeing movies that he saw when he was 9 and he's seeing again now. All the possibilities for finding moral opening that exist in the fact that texts aren't monolithic and provide temporally spread out openings for other readings. And here again, just a word of deep admiration for the research that brought so much of that to fruition. So thank you, Werner, for a great book.
Well, I am going to approach this from a rather different perspective. Some months ago, Werner and I had lunch, and he was telling me about this book. And I understood that I was one of the eyewitnesses to these events. I was in the Army right after World War II, and I also realized that there are not so many of us left. And I thought it would be interesting to provide a perspective from people who had actually lived through these events. The book actually had a great impact on me because it made me rethink events of nearly 70 years ago that I hadn't thought about very often, and it created a kind of avalanche of memories, and it actually made me rethink a number of events. I will explain in a moment, some that I think are rather strange. I apologize ahead of time for reacting so self-referentially, but you know, I'm not a student of literature, and I don't know any other way to respond to this book, just to sort of say what it made me think about. Furthermore, I took comfort from Werner's title, Tales of the 1940s. Well, I want to contribute a few tales of my own. From the perspective of a group that does not appear much in this book, if at all, but that played a very significant role in this period, that is the period of the immediate post-war period, and a rather odd role. And I'm talking about the refugees in the American Army. I would say, I don't know what the figures are, but my impression is that they were at least 85% Jewish who served in the occupation. The Army did not like us particularly. We were often referred to as the specialists. But they couldn't do without us because we knew languages, and languages were in extremely short supply. Many knew German, French, some knew Russian, and we played an important role in the occupation. We were the people who largely administered the Fragebogen. We were running, in fact, the denazification process. Many of us, though I was not personally, were involved in Operation Paperclip, which was the major effort to bring German scientists to the United States. This was the period also of the so-called tally-ho raids, where we would surround smallish German towns in the middle of the night and put people through a very quick interrogation to identify people who were in the so-called automatic arrest category, relatively high functionaries in the party or in the military. We also did a certain amount of strategic interrogation because this was the Cold War was on the horizon, and we wanted to know about the experience of the German army with the Russians. I once took part, I think I told Werner, in the interrogation of a high-ranking German officer who said to me, you have excellent pronunciation and the vocabulary of a 10-year-old. It was actually quite an accurate evaluation. I arrived in Oberammergau, where the European Theater Intelligence School was located. You know, I was barely 18. One of my main teachers was somebody called Henry Kissinger, class of 1950 at Harvard. He sounded then just the way he sounds now. And interestingly enough, you know, Oberammergau is the place where the Passion plays were, and they tried to put them on again at this period, but they couldn't do it because the only member of the Passion plays who had not been a Nazi was Judas. I want to try also sort of suggest what this period was like. I remember sitting in the mess, and somebody on my left said, "Henry, please pass the Blumenkohl," because many of the people in our units didn't really speak English very well. I think that we were people with very mixed feelings. Actually, one of the great discoveries I made by reading this book was the fact that I don't know, and Werner doesn't go into this very much, the sort of atmosphere in the occupation. The Germans were starving. Any woman was available for half a pack of cigarettes, and all restraints sort of absolutely dropped away. I mean, my powers of description aren't very good, but it was a sort of, for somebody who had been raised fairly, you know, reasonable circumstances, it was a sort of wild catch as catch can. But I did not fraternize. There are very few people who did not fraternize. And I said to myself always that I didn't fraternize because I was Jewish. And then, in reading Werner's book, a great truth came on me. I didn't fraternize, not because I was Jewish, but because I was scared of the girls. I don't know whether there are not many young people in this room, but if you can imagine that somebody of my age at that time really had very little experience of any kind, certainly not with the opposite sex. It was, when I think back of it, quite amazing. I tried to explain all of this to one of my grandchildren the other day, very unsuccessfully. But there is a more serious aspect to this. Before going home, I was stationed in Wiesbaden. It was the headquarters of the Air Force. And we were occupying the house of a leading German eye specialist. And because I spoke German, I was sort of the person who was dealing with the housekeeper who had stayed. And I think I was very polite, but I was very distant. And the day I was going home, this lady called me and she said, "Mr. Rosovsky, you're going home. I have a present for your mother." I said, "You have a present for my mother?" She gave me a tile, you know, kind of thing you put a hot plate on. You got to realize that the Germans at that time were working for used coffee grounds. And she said, give this to your mother and tell her that not all Germans are as bad as you think they are. I still have that tile. And in fact, I often think about it because there was a kind of moral arrogance in my attitude. And I think she understood that. And I think it's something that I think has to be understood. I mean, when you place yourself in that particular time. I also often thought about this during the McCarthy period in the United States, where, moral courage was not very evident. What were people risking during the McCarthy period? At worst, they risked the job. What were people risking in Germany at that time? They were risking not just their own lives, but the lives of their families and a great deal more besides. I have many images of that period in my mind. I was in Wiesbaden at the first concert that Walter Gieseking gave after World War II. He was suspected of being a Nazi and was forbidden to play concerts, and this was at the beginning of 1947, and this was his first concert. And my vision was of sitting in the casino concert hall in Wiesbaden. There was no heat in the building, and Gieseking playing, and every breath was sort of a cloud of steam coming out of his mouth. In a way, that's also rather symbolic of the period that you describe. I want to conclude by making 2 points, one cultural and one question. I was one of very few people that served both in the occupation of Japan and the occupation of Germany, so a double occupier. And I noticed a very interesting difference between the two. Germans were very willing, and in fact quite anxious, to talk about their experiences during the war. They would say, yes, I was in Russia, I was here, I was in France, and they were happy to discuss the beauty of Paris or what have you. Japanese never talked about their wartime experiences. I can't explain it, but it is a fact. Finally, I think there is one very important point, which isn't so much what Werner was focusing on, but that's what I was thinking a lot when reading the book, and that is, how does the occupier get changed by the act of of running the occupation? I think it changed many of us, certainly not always for the better. In fact, I think on balance, it was, for those who participated, a morally negative experience in many ways. Perhaps the black soldiers are perhaps an exception because it made them see a world that they had not really seen before. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to some of the issues that your discussants have raised?
Sure. I want to make sure that we have quite a bit of room for questions,
So
discussion
why
from
don't
the
you do
audience.
it
But I
just
do it very,
briefly,
very,
yeah.
very quickly. I think the three points there of utopian openings, the third space elements that Janet Halley outlined, I think is absolutely right. I see the book now through your eyes in that way, that one can think of children, humor, and also revision in all aesthetic representations that go into the book as three of those moments. Also the avoidance of the mirroring, the finding yourself in a situation where you have this dyadic attitude that also comes into the point of your sensitivity toward arrogance. You put yourself into a righteous position, you have somebody whom you can accuse, and you can replicate all kinds of dramas. And how can one break out of that, and how much self-consciousness is there in the period of people who try to break out of that very mechanism. So that's certainly something that I was after and was trying to pursue. And since you mentioned the story of Toxie, maybe I can just use one example to illustrate that, because the film, if you do the ideological critique, it's a set of German actors, most of whom have a Nazi past, many of whom have participated in propaganda films, and the question that the film asks, can a mixed-race child be integrated into a German family? So at that moment, I asked myself the question, it's like freaks, you're one of us, we accept you. It becomes a very, very weird thing of a bunch of Nazi actors in the early 1950s saying, yes, we can accept a mixed-race kid. And then you look at the biographies, and you see that the composer of the song, who had also composed Nazi songs in the 40s, was gay, had been arrested by the Gestapo, and he could compose these songs, but his name couldn't appear in the credits, and that was how he avoided anything worse. And Paul Bildt, who is the actor who plays the liberal grandfather in Toxie, who was sort of the exhibit A, he was in Kolberg, one of the last Nazi propaganda films, was married to a Jewish actress, and there's a secret file on him that you can find in the Berlin Document Center that says he must never see this, but he is Jüdisch versippt, he has a Jewish family, and so he could be blackmailed to do anything that the party wanted him to do. And in 1945, he tried to commit suicide together with his daughter. His wife died in February 45. So in April or May 1945, he tried to commit suicide, and his daughter died, but he survived. It was the typical poison suicide. So now he's the liberal grandfather, and all of a sudden I felt, why am I, throwing up this guy as the target? Exactly.
I was kind of trying to move really quickly, but right. The sudden way that you, by drilling down and re-seeing it, reset the moral question. Right. Anyway, that was a breathtaking moment.
So I'm very, very grateful for your comments, and also, Henry, for yours. I think the questionnaire in itself is such an interesting instrument. You ask 188 questions and say, when did you become a member? And then comes the problem of evaluation, because is it better to have joined earlier? So you were a convinced Nazi, but they hadn't done anything too terrible yet. Were you better if you joined in 1937 when it became the law? You couldn't be a journalist unless you were a party member or not. So all these evaluation of it, or were you in fact sometimes a better judge, even though you had joined the party, than someone who hadn't joined the party, but who was opportunistic nonetheless. So the evaluation of individuals with this measure is amazingly difficult. And there's a wonderful dissertation on that topic that I came across. I think I only have one little footnote in the book. An Armenian American who helped to devise the questionnaire and evaluated it. He had like 40,000 questionnaires that he evaluated. He then went back to NYU and wrote a dissertation on the denazification, in which he had one footnote and said, I myself had some chance to observe this, although he had looked at 40,000 of those questionnaires. And he just thought it was a terrible instrument for accomplishing what it set out to accomplish. So you had a big army involved in a bureaucratic procedure, the core of which was very difficult to use as a tool for which it was set up. So one of the many, many ironies of the moment. And thank you also for the perspective of being in this very particular category of language specialist, Blumenkohl requiring, Jewish Blumenkohl, yes, of being on the one hand needed as a language mediator, but also mistrusted by the army. Thomas Dodd, who wrote the letters home to his wife from Nuremberg, complained constantly about all these Jews. Hey, what are these Jews doing in our army? This kind of. So you have a very good sense from the core of a Nuremberg trial participant how much anti-Semitism was part of the daily routine, and that maybe is one of the additional things that what happened to the occupiers was your question. On the one hand, there's a book about the Black civil rights movement gaining impetus from the experience of the Black GIs in Germany, where there was more of a free space for them than there was in the South, where most of the Black soldiers came from. But I think it also is since anti-Semitism had shown the most horribly imaginable face in the first half of the 1940s, to continue that as an everyday routine, I think, seemed to become more and more difficult. And so the soldiers who actually went to Germany were also soldiers who experienced that and made America recoil from its own anti-Semitism in the years following the Second World War. So I would think that's also a change, that an effect among the occupiers that the occupation brought about.
Well, can I start with a question and a brief anecdote? You remember we met in Frankfurt after I spoke at the Frankfurt Book Fair.
Right.
And after dinner you said, let me show you around Frankfurt. And in fact, you showed me the area where there was this particular house in which you used to play with your friends. Where there was a hotel and the toilet, the story you just mentioned. Yeah. And I was convinced that I had actually put it in my talk, but magically and thankfully it had somehow escaped so that you could have the story, and I hadn't anticipated it. But what I asked you a question at that night, I remember, which we spent a long night walking around Frankfurt. And, what about your own traumatic experience? Was it here when we talk about the recursivity of the book, as Janet has talked about, through certain forms of repetition, right, you begin to recover certain memories, you put them in a perspective, and so on. Usually that recursivity is also tied in with a certain sense of trauma, whether it's a very profound one or whether it's less so. And there's nothing in the book really which goes to that issue. Now, you're perfectly free to say, I don't want to talk about it. You're not Mr. Freud, and I'm not. But on the other hand, it did strike me as being a very interesting, for me, an interesting issue on that occasion and on this one.
Well, I called the book The Temptation of Despair because succumbing to the temptation of despair was not an uncommon thing in the 40s. So there were two of my uncles who committed suicide, although that was at that time really covered up so that they had, accidents, but everybody really knew what was happening. So the extent to which people who were close relatives would be affected by, just what the 1940s meant was something very, very direct. And of course, also the loss of my sister, of my grandmother, in 1945, I think is something that I was too young to take in, and it was a normal family story, but it never amounted to the kind of context that I actually needed to confront. So I think that certainly did go into was a story that was my story, but it wasn't a story that one talked about very much, I think.
Yeah, and this I just am reminded of this because my grandfather-in-law also committed suicide in this period, and my in-laws for a long time would not talk about it. It was seen as a heroic act a man who refused to think of even leaving outside of Germany, to release his family, to go and live in England, and that he wouldn't fall in their way. And it was only when I much later realized that this was a very tragic act, but there's a way of covering this up, I think, quite often, that it's been.
Well, may I take this? I mean, is it okay if we take
Just,
this round
just
a little bit?
one, sorry, I've taken more time than I should have. Just one word and then I want to move on.
Well, I would recommend reading the diary, A Woman in Berlin, because it's often been read as a kind of emotionally cauterized author who doesn't understand how bad her experience is. And I think one of the things that's great about it is the way that she puts that in play as a theme in the diary. But it's not accessible to her to make the diary be about her trauma. It even seems anachronistic to me to imagine that it would be. So I think that she puts it in problem,
Right.
and rather than makes that her story.
Questions? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
From the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. I both have family that have been involved in some of these issues, but also have read a considerable amount, given my interest in mass atrocities. And I'm interested in what you, Werner, think, but also the panelists, in this notion of what is accessible at the time and what you have to do to get through it is an exercise that I understand to be violative of memory, at least for a while. And then there is usually a very difficult period of time for people to come back to a life where memories are not helpful. So this process of reflection and going back to built and destroyed objects and seeing life in small parts in relationship to that, I think is a brilliant way to get traumatized people to start thinking more robustly about their entire process. It's part of the revisionism you're talking about, or revision. And I think the account of being an interpreter in the occupation is also wonderful because everybody was young then. You were young. You said you were young, 18.
Very young.
And an inexperienced 18. Werner, you were young. So your memories are to some extent filtered by youth. But my question here is, are you seeing generalities? Because I'm seeing generalities as well as profound insights into this post-war period. That the effect on this kind of process on people and families is that you're not going to get good stories from them unless they're made up for a very long time. And this work of excavation is essential to allow people 10, 15, 40 years later to begin to explore it. So as you've been working and writing on this, or those of you who are commenting, do you see generalities?
Werner.
I mean, the pattern that you described is what made me look for sources from the period itself, because I was not so much interested in the later refiguring, only insofar as the revision showed that refiguring, but the original text always had to be from the 40s. My last text is from 1952 as a primary source in order to get the kind of raw feeling and the avoidance and the mirroring and the putting things in play but confronting. I think that's what struck me. I mean, I'm a member of the 68 generation, and it was always the common assumption that there had not been any confrontation with the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust before the 60s generation heroically put that on the table. And what surprised me in the book is how much of the confrontation actually does go on in a very direct and raw way immediately after the war, even in the middle of all kinds of other situations that demand attention. And then comes that strange thing that the right usurps a kind of rhetoric about suffering more generally, and that's when we have a political splitting that makes your question almost impossible to answer in the German context, because if you talk about expulsions or population transfers, you must be on the right. If you talk about the Holocaust, you seem not to be on the extreme. There seem to be very, very odd ways in which talking about general experiences of confronting trauma or whatever horrible events seems difficult.
One comment from, the American perspective. I think a lot of American soldiers who were over there, came from all over the country, had really no particular background in any of this. I remember going to Dachau, and kids, they were all kids, used to sit in the ovens and have their pictures taken. Right? I mean, that was, and I don't think that they even had any sense of that was in any way, I don't know what word to use. Insensitive is not. But I also can't think of any major novels, at least in English. And I have not read, I will read that, but I think of major novels that deal with the occupation. Are there?
I think Werner's bibliography would be a great place
to
start. They're not necessarily great novels, but they were written then, and he's really got the book does make you want to just reassemble his bookshelf and read them all. I think one of the things that I wanted to bring to the table was this desire for comparison. Is rape the fate worse than death? Is death the fate worse than rape? Mm-hmm. Is it worse for the Soviets to rape the German women, or for the German soldier? So there's something falsifying about it once those chains of logic get started, and so how did? But that's what I think, Jennifer, is so hard for later, for people who've gone through it to talk about it in a way, like I often talk about rape, and I go around talking about rape, and gay men will come up to me afterwards and will say, "Oh, I've been raped. It was awful," and I just don't want it to be construed in that one way, that it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it was an absolute domination, and my life will never be get over, and I had no role in how it happened, because that would be blaming the victim, and all that stuff that goes with talking about rape in kind of polite society now. They say, I'll just keep it to myself. And so it's that anxiety about being stuck into an ideologically predetermined track about it that I think makes it so hard to, and it make me love this book of thinking, there could be some real contributions brought to this by a literary sensibility, because a literary sensibility could do some things to identify the layers of representation and see where the iterations crack apart a bit. So I think that's how I would take up your really good question.
Please, question here. Please wait for the mic and introduce yourself, please.
I'm struck
Introduce yourself.
I'm Sarah Friedman. I'm struck by what you said about the difference between people in Germany, that you had been involved in the occupation in both countries, and that people in Germany were readily talking about what happened and people in Japan did not. I don't know, my comment isn't really about Japan, but I think it's a hard comparison to make in the sense that you were a German speaker and I assumed that they were speaking to you in German, which makes a huge difference, even if you're fluent in another language, to be able to speak into your own language. To someone in their language, in the language in which their own language. And I'm also wondering, because I don't know if GIs who did not speak German had your same experience. And I'm also wondering the phenomenon of Germans perhaps knowing that you were Jewish. Maybe they didn't, maybe they did. And that experience of people, and this happens around white and black in the United States, of being able to talk to someone who has been in your experience of being a Jew, and I assume you were born in Germany or you're a German speaker, and by telling you their stories, there's a kind of absolution, because if you are listening, there's some kind of emotional release because you as a Jew and a German are listening to them. And to some extent, they're creating a human bond. So I think it may be quite different because that experience, who you were, and the language is very different than the occupation. I don't know, but it just occurred to me.
You spoke Japanese too.
Yes, but not at that time. I learned Japanese later. And I think it's a very interesting point.
Another question, please.
I, by the way, was not making a comparison. I was making a statement, an observation. Yeah.
Yes, question at the end there and one here.
Charlotte Zilaidi. In dealing with the effects of Charlotte Zilaidi. In dealing with the effects of total war, we've seen that there are several ways of going about that confrontation, and we've seen some of the visceral reactions that came out, at the process of being confronted with guilt. We've also seen the other type of reaction with art, trying to grasp that which, the ruins of total war. But even there, the humanizing aspect that we see, when children are put in, in between the ruins, is offset in some ways by the fact that we're behind the lens. There's a distance that is created there. So in finding another way, maybe either a very raw way of dealing with trauma, or a highly intellectual, reasoning, reflective way. Do you find that post-war German society and even discourses that go on today have gone beyond that dyad which Adorno offered, either of dealing with the past, doing away with it, or working through it? Are there discussions about this in Germany today, and what is the current discourse about dealing with this?
I think Judith Ryan could probably answer that better than I can. But I think one of the issues that comes to the fore in 1945 is exactly an anxiety about modes of representation that had been used by fascists. So the idea of a realist aesthetic becomes more problematic after the 9th of May, 1945. My exhibit A is Wolfgang Köppen, who said that he read Ulysses in 1922, but he didn't try to imitate Joyce until the 9th of May, 1945. And so the idea that you begin to become more acceptable in a morally charged universe by being more experimental. And one way to imagine this book would have been to go for the experimentalist who resist realistic representation to the nth degree in order to show their anti-fascist adherence. And you'd find quite a bit of it, not only in Germany. I think Beckett was a Red Cross aide in the Vélodrome d'Hiver in Paris, and Waiting for Godot can very well be seen in relationship to his wartime experience as one way, very indirectly and vaguely and in a modernistic fashion to deal with that. I chose the texts that were published in the period and would somehow still want to thematize what was confronted, and that's why I included Köppen. Köppen, by the way, his first book after the war was actually the transcription and then the editing and modernizing of a Jewish survivor's autobiography, which at the end of Köppen's life he published as a novel in his own name, which caused a very big uproar. That's sort of the last big conflict that I followed in Germany on that score, with Surkamp Jüdischer Verlag publishing one version and Fischer publishing the other version in order to bring the debate to a fore. But I think self-consciousness, and I think that's where Adorno's argument also fit in, so resisting the modes of representation that had been depleted by fascist abuses seemed to be a formal way out of the dilemma for writers. Photographers, I think you'd have to go to abstract photography then, and you know, I guess the ruin will be the picture itself rather than the thing represented.
May I ask a question about, relates to the last two comments. In 1945, things were obviously, much more black and white than they are today, right? You talk about, there wasn't much issue about who was guilty, who was not guilty, and even, issues about, say, the bombings, the Cabot, and so on, they were not discussed because people said, well, what the hell, we just lived through London, etc. Since then, a lot of things have become much more nuanced. We didn't know at that time, for example, most of us didn't know how all of Europe cooperated with the German occupation. Well, that was a very compromising thing that people didn't want to hear about. And I think today it's much more when, the rest of Europe sort of deals with the Germans, it's a very different atmosphere than it was immediately after the war, right?
Right. Judith, you want to say a word in this, around this topic before, before we take the next question?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the dedicated or designated responder to this question. It seems to me that there have been so many different phases, but what's interesting about what both Werner and Henry were saying was that there are nuances to this that need to be brought out again, and that there isn't simply one side or the other. I don't think that in 1945 and immediately thereafter there was a totally black and white view of things, but I think the nuancing took a lot of time, and it took a lot of time in part because the question of who was guilty and the question whether there was such a thing as collective guilt and a lot of other ramifications of that sort of reflection. And now we've come to much younger generations who really do have to find out this story second or third hand. So I think the situation has changed, and obviously I really can't go into all those details, but I really applaud Werner for having written this book, because it is something that allows us to see close up what we often only see through the filter of other media, such as the Fragebogen, for example. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Sollors. Thank you for being a good mentor and a colleague. I'm Jacob Olukbona, African American and African Studies. I'm interested in comparison. And as I hear the comments and the summaries, my mind sort of flipped back to the Nigerian Biafran Civil War. And those of you who have been following the news will know that Nigeria is in trouble. It's almost the killing in northern Nigeria is almost a daily occurrence. And it seems to me that one of the problems that we face in these kinds of crises, of violence and war, is that it is very hard to deal with it as soon as it's finished. Nigeria probably made a great mistake by just saying, you know, everything is fine, we are the same, life continues. We never dealt with it, we didn't discuss it, so we were not even able to bring it to a closure. So all the issues that were raised at that time, I was 15 years when that war started, they are still coming up. So my question for you, given these kinds of things, and I'm going to be reading it, and I'll read it from that perspective, that what can I learn from your book about my own situation in Nigeria, is it because of the nature of the violence and war that generally we are not able to deal with that, and as a result of that, it lingers on, you know, for quite a while. If you look at Rwanda too, Rwanda and Burundi, the same thing happened. They're still caught up in the same thing, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to solve it until people are able to sit down, to sort things out, and then to be able to say, this is the way to go. So that's my question for you.
Well, there are a whole number of historical books that have shown the continuity in our savage continent, bloodlands, you know, of the violence that came to the highest fore in World War II. I didn't give the grim facts, you know, 60 million people killed and 13 million during World War II intentionally killed through mass slaughter that included the Holocaust. So that, you know, on the 9th of May...
Between Eastern Germany and Western Russia.
Right.
That's
yeah.
the bloodlands.
Right,
Yes.
right. That's the bloodlands. Yeah. It's the Eastern Front in World War II. And so on the 9th of May, you know, you have a lot of loose things running around. So nobody was able to say, you know, everything goes back to normal at midnight or at 9 a.m. And the idea that nation states will be happier if they don't have ethnic minorities in them, you know, meant that the Hungarians had to be expelled from Czechoslovakia, and that the DPs who came from the Soviet sphere of influence had to be brought back to the Soviet Union, even if it meant that they would die there or, you know, were even killed on the transport there. So you have a continued thing. So your point of looking at a conflict that, you know, seems to have been resolved at a particular moment and then all of a sudden lingers on, I think is certainly reflected into the 1950s still. I mean, certainly the 1940s, a continuation of modes of violent expression, so that the most sarcastic formulation that I came, that's I think in Bloodlands, is that it was Hitler's concept of creating ethnically purified nations was the concept that people adhered to in the name of fighting back against what Hitler had done. So one of the tragic mirroring effects that you could look at. So there is something about mass violence that can generate more mass violence very, very easily and readily. And revenge motifs, I mean, we all are subject to feeling, you know, vengeful at some point. And so when something very dramatic has happened, you seem justified in also doing outrageous things in retaliation. So I think you're right that you know, genocidal situations very often breed more genocidal situations.
But Werner, it's not true that, and you know, this is a question to the Germanists here, that quite apart from breeding more you know, genocidal actual situations or events, the impact on cinema, on literature, theater of this violence has had even a much longer history than the 50s and 60s in Germany. And it is something that continues in a very deep and harrowing way.
Yeah, continued representation.
And it is not, you can't work it out, so to speak, as you think you might be able to. Yes. I'm going to take two more questions, this one and another final question.
Irv Plotkin, I was very interested in the portions of your book that show the artists, the graphic artists. I don't know if you know the work of Samuel Bach, who shows locally in the Pakasafrai Gallery, but you might want to look at that. But I don't know whether I followed, it's B-A-K, Samuel. I don't know whether I followed one of the quotations from your reading properly, and it gave me a little pause. The artist that was comparing the results of the bombing to the results of an earthquake, which even from 10 feet would look the same, and certainly from above would look the same, and saying that they're both inexplicable. It seemed to me that one is explicable and the other is an act of nature.
Yeah,
or
this
that.
was
it
Max
seemed like a
Frisch's,
cop-out in a
the Swiss
sense.
diarist who was making the distinction that at least you don't have to try to explain it. If it's a natural disaster, you just say it just happened. But here is a man-made disaster, so it requires a set of
Oh,
explanations.
you were saying it does require.
That's what
I
his
misheard
argument.
you there.
Yeah, no, his argument was that. I try to condense the quotation so you just get sort of the bare knuckles of the earthquake comparison. So while many of the writers are associating earthquakes, he particularly distinguishes the earthquake by saying, if God did it, you can ask the theodicy. And I thought there are allusions to the Lisbon earthquake in some of the comments still in the 1940s, that the big question, how can there be a benevolent God if Lisbon can be in ruins now? But that's a different question from saying, how did human beings create this in order to destroy the city in this particular way?
A final question. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.